Volume 7 C 115. I'm free. I can hardly believe it. And, of all things, I suppose I'll have to report to him soon, to arrange travel to the Elf Kingdom. And Nua sat at the table while Raymond went about busying himself with nothing in particular at his desk. Yes. In a few days, you'll be bound for your old home, and I'll probably be hunted by the Aganti. Not that they'll have much luck, Raymond said with a smirk earned over a lifetime of victories. Nua frowned, stood up, and approached him. She reached down and took his face into her hands. You really did it, you set me free. If I'd told him what you almost did, Cardinal or no, if I'd. How did you know I wouldn't ask them to do anything to you? Her sky-blue eyes searched his face, and she felt the goosebumps rise beneath her fingers. I didn't. But if you wanted to make me pay for what I'd done, what I was going to do, I couldn't refuse. You had a right to hate me. I've never been the good man I thought I was, not until recently, and nothing done in so little a time can make up for everything before it. An end by your word or your hand. How could I have said it would have been undeserved? Raymond asked the question just as he'd asked it of himself. But your gods, your faith, even your country, not to mention your life? Isn't that extreme? Don't you? Nua didn't get to finish. Not even a little. Raymond answered. I won't live a long life. I've always known that, even by human standards, I put myself at risk too often, tempted fates, gods, and monsters for all my life. I'm lucky I made it this far. Anything beyond the day I'm living in, that's a gift. Every day I wake up, it's a surprise to me. You're worth it. Even if I never see you again after you leave, I've got no regrets. You realize, you know more about me than anyone ever has. I've never spoken of some of the things I've said to you. I needed to say some of those things. And thank you for these, even if they weren't given back on purpose, she said and wiggled her ears up and down. Being cut off from my very race. It was hard. I'm finally whole again, in every way. I'm glad. I never knew they were that significant. Raymond replied and tried to look away from her. She held him fast. Have you never touched one of my people before? Nua asked. No, other than no, he insisted. Not even when you were younger, like revenge? Nua asked with care. If you lie to me, Raymond, I will know the truth. After my people killed the woman you loved and put her mutilated corpse in a tree, what did you do? Do you really want to know? Raymond asked. I do. I really do. You know everything about me now. And that's not fair. I can't promise I won't think differently of you, but before we part ways, I want to know what kind of man. What kind of man you really are, Nua said while her heart began to thud. When she died, no. When we found what was left of her, I was angry. I ran from my unit, not away. But I went on the hunt. I stalked the woods and killed some of those elves who had been hunting us. I might have been killed then too, but I was rescued, pulled out of danger. Then I went back to the city. And Raymond swallowed the lump in his throat. I got drunk. I crawled into a bottle laced with black dust, and I practically lived in it for a year. Maybe more. Raymond pursed his lips. Do you know what black dust does? What makes it so dangerous? I know about it. The trade is almost non-existent in a theocracy though. Messes with the head, it creates hallucinations, feelings of pleasure. One of the lords I used to serve, about 100 years or so ago, he baked it into cakes to enhance the pleasure of sex. Nua acknowledged, and when she slid her arms around his head, he explained. More than that. It takes away who you were, who you are. It can even take memories. I diluted the stuff with liquor, and drank until I forgot her face. I forgot her face and I still can't remember it. I remember all the things we did, all the things we shared. But the sound of her voice, her face, I erased it. Her. So, when I leave, and we're parted, what are you going to do? Are you going to erase me? Nua asked, his head was warm to the touch. No. He is warm. She corrected herself. No. I made that mistake once. I don't want to forget this, to forget you. And I can't get lost in a bottle. I have work to do. I have to undo what we've done. I have to save your people from my country and my country from itself. When you leave, I'm going to get really drunk. But when I leave, when I go back to my homeland, I'll be sober and sharp as my knives, ready to work again. I can promise you that. Nua, he said with resolve and looked up, but not for long, as she crouched down. I've never done this before. Not even with Elon. I loved him. But he was, after all, my master's son, and though he was shy and reticent, I could see he thought of me as his. If I'd been less naive then, if I knew what lay in store, I would have been repulsed. Her body quivered as she took Raymond's wrists in her slender fingers. But you're different. So different that it's hard to believe you're even human. Raymond's mouth opened. Nua, what? Shh. I want to do this while I'm brave enough. She answered, and their lips snapped shut at the same moment. Her ears moved up and down once more, and she brought his hands to them. I've never offered that touch to anyone before. After they were taken, there was no way for me to give it. They were gone. So, you're my first, Nua whispered and lowered her eyes as blissful feelings caused her body to shiver, adding ecstasy to her tight-strung nerves. Nua, I was going to, Raymond whispered. Everything in him told him to pull his hands away, to yank his fingers away like they would burn if he let them linger, but he couldn't, he didn't. No, you weren't, you couldn't. I thought maybe. But you couldn't. If that were all, I would have put your hands there now. But this is my choice. I'm free, and I want this before we go our separate ways. She closed her eyes and shivered as the ecstasy built in her body. Do they feel good to you? Yes. Like silk, with the give and warmth of rising bread, and yet firm, smooth. He couldn't stop his stroking motion, and she tittered while looking down. Like rising bread, you know how to make a girl feel special. I've never heard that one before. She chuckled a little more and she could feel his blush. I don't know how to say. Raymond started, and Nua kept her ears fixed in his hands when she looked up at him. You don't say. You just act. Like this, Nua said, but as she brought her head towards him, he was doing the same down toward her, their lips locked in a kiss as they rose to their feet. They didn't remove clothing as tender lovers, but tore it apart. Her hands ripped away his fine robe as his fingers tore away the laced-up shirt to expose her breasts, and he brought his lips down to feast on them. They stumbled toward the bed, and she shouted as he landed on her, "Kiss them! Kiss them!" With a human woman he would have thought something more, but with her, he knew she meant what she counted to be far more intimate, and brought his lips to the tip of her left ear. Her entire body bucked underneath him. To his surprise, she was far stronger than he thought, and it was only being entwined with her that kept him from being cast away. He nibbled, licked, and traced his way over her left ear, and then went to the right. My neck. Kiss my neck. She angled her head to expose her naked throat, and he kissed the place where her collar once lay. She moaned and roamed her hands over his body. He was, despite his years as a human, clearly a hardened warrior still. Muscle ran up and down his length. Every inch of him was hard, save for his lips, which he pressed to her with loving firmness and hungry passion. Her breasts crushed against his chest as her legs hooked behind his thighs and her hands went to his broad back to dig into the skin there. She began to tease at his shaft, her own body already prepared, slick, wet, and wanting. His beard added to the way he felt, like little bristles teasing at her sensitive skin. He wasn't within her yet, but the promise from them both was there, the way their bodies came closer and closer to connecting. Nua. 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 He gasped out her name each time he felt her nether lips pressed to the head of his shaft. Now. Tell me. I know it. So tell me. She moaned. Say it. Please. Whether it was a request, or a plea, or a want or a desire or an urgent need, he knew exactly what she meant the moment she said it, no matter how he denied it. As if he was dying, every single instant from first meeting and first pity, from his first shame to his last bliss and regret, passed before his eyes, and he couldn't deny it to himself any longer. I love you, he shouted it, and she drew him in, slowly at first to savor the feel. She called out. Again. Say it again. I love you. I love you, he cried out as he felt her body engulf him to the last. He couldn't say it again as her lips captured his and they began to rock back and forth, driving flesh to flesh in nature's oldest dance and strongest magic. Before her eyes, as before his, every moment passed as well. When did he love me? When did I love him? Was it when he turned against his friends, his country, his gods? Was it before? Was it the moment he sold himself to set me free? There was no answer to those questions that she'd asked herself as the memories replayed until they became only distant background in the primal dance and ecstasy drove her away. He treated her most sensitive places with both hunger and affection, drawing himself out of her to take his mouth on a journey through the valley of her breasts and down to her quivering sex. His lips parted hers and latched, and his tongue teased and taunted before his lips latched onto her clit, and her back arched and her cries woke most of the hotel before she grabbed him by the hair on his head and yanked him back up to her mouth and forced him to silence her. When at last she felt him draw near to the edge, near to a climax of his own, she slammed herself against him as hard as she could, tightened her body's hold on him, and whispered breathily into his ear, "Do it." He groaned, his warmth flowing into her drained him more than 100 battles. He began to relax, resting on her chest until his manners returned and he rolled off of her. A gentleman to the last, she laughed and wiped her forehead clean of sweat. "Hey, ha. Is this really the time for laughter?" he asked. "There's none better. Now, come a little closer, let's get some sleep. There's a lot to do tomorrow and we both need to be well rested for it," Noah said and inched herself closer so that he was spooning her. She pulled his arm on top of her like a blanket, and they lay that way until sleep took them both. Volume 7 C 116. She woke up early, before Brain, before Layali. The sun wasn't even up, the stars were still visible. Her skin felt a tingle, a pull urging her somewhere. She dressed in silence, taking only an extra moment to put on her sword, then ventured out. Her body felt light, ghost-like, and though she walked one foot in front of the other, it felt more like she was gliding, an airy call to her form, guided by the prickling tingle on her skin and telling her when she was going the right direction. Down the stairs and down the hall, she was alone, a light fog over her mind that, though it didn't keep her from her awareness, made it all more dreamlike, distant, as if she were watching herself and operating her own body as if it were a puppet. "Whose door is this?" she wondered when her hand went up to shoulder height and knocked. "Come in, I've been waiting for you," the soft voice within said, and thus invited, she reached for the handle, opened it, and passed through to the other side. The tingle in her skin faded away, and the distant foggy feeling went with it. "What? Why am I here?" She reached up to her head and touched her skull through her strands of thick black hair. "What was that?" "It's Shrine Maiden's call, and I'm a Shrine Maiden. I can maiden any old shrine I like, and priestess so hard I'd convert rocks if I wanted to." She gave a silly grin and a wink to the half-elf, and she cocked her head. "Say what now?" she asked. "I'd better go. Layali wouldn't be happy if you did. I'm Lomega, by the way." The red and white-clad girl bent slightly forward at the waist, but she froze. Her hand squeezed the metal handle, crushing it in her grip. "What do you know about my Layali?" she asked through gritted teeth. "That she loves you very, very much, and is terrified that you'll die out there. She's terrified for both you and her papa, Brain," Omega said, and she's hand on the door handle began to relax. "She offered a great deal to me in exchange for my help, a very great deal. And now I'm going to fulfill my part of the bargain," Omega added. "Bargain?" she asked with a steady stare. "Yes. Bargain. All you have to do is stand there, and then all you have to do is say nothing," Omega promised, and drew out her wooden sword. She stood still, braced and ready for an attack, but instead the curious maiden withdrew by a step, then two, and then a faint hint of musical notes began to play from somewhere. The Shrine Maiden's feet began to move in a complex dance, her swaying hips, hair and rising feet moved in a multitude of pirouettes, and then, it was done. She rose to her feet, and gestured to the door. "There, you can go," Omega said. "I doubt we'll meet again for some time, and I'm sure you've got questions, but those can wait. Just trust me, you'll understand what happened here, soon enough." The woman's hand came up and her fingers wiggled out of sync in a curious sort of farewell wave, and she, unsure of what else she could even do in such a situation, left the room the way she'd come, and made her way to the arena. Why she didn't go back to Brain and Layali was something she couldn't quite answer. The chill of the early morning air, the fog amidst the darkness, the world itself concealed its emptiness from her. Though the temperatures were nothing she couldn't handle, Nonetheless, she rubbed her biceps with her hands, her long hair dangling and dancing behind her, every step carrying her ever closer to a lifetime's wish, and nobody was there to see it. The chilly morning left goosebumps on her skin long before she reached her destination, and at such an early hour, nobody was at the arena either. Even though it took plenty of time to get there, not so much as a guard was present. I suppose that's no surprise. Who is going to steal used practice swords and hunks of wooden or metal men? There's nothing here of value until people show up, she told herself as she walked beneath the great high stone arches. Her footfalls echoed as the darkness became pitch-like, hidden from the stars with only the breeze at her back to keep her company, the breeze, and her thoughts. How many years has it been? She tried to recall as her foot tapped along the stone until she reached the sands. I was younger than Layali when I promised my mother I would kill my father. I'm sure of that. But how much? As she tallied the days of her more than 100-year lifespan, the years back became a blur. Her isolation from the world made so much of it blend together as she had to wonder, what if I'm older than I think I am? Nobody had celebrated her birthday after she was removed from her mother, not until Raymond became her handler. What a ridiculous sight that was. She chuckled a little as she went to take position on the sands as if her father were already there. The hard-bitten black scripture head, carrying a lemon cake, and Senna, handing her the little cube with different colors on it. How many times did I play with that stupid thing, and I never once got close to solving it. The years of revenge fantasies punctuated by monster hunts and living in shadows never weighed on her before, but now, having been out in the world, and traveling with Brain and Layali, she knew. I can't go back to that life. I can't, and I won't, she told herself. The other thoughts that troubled her began to fade away with fresh resolve, and though she still had no idea why she'd come all this way at such an early hour, she was content to wait and watch the stars. Her eyes turned up to watch the passing of night until the sun began its slow march across the sky. The crowd began to fill the arena shortly after first light. The sea of faces and cacophony of voices was enough to make her ears twitch with mild annoyance. Humans are loud. Very loud. Notably though, there were some non-humans in the mix, foreigners who came to watch a historical event. On one level it marked the significance of the duel in the eyes of the world around them, on the other it also marked the weakness of the Empire in its current state that it would allow races normally considered dangerous to enter without argument. Beastmen, orcs, even a few trolls took seats. I suppose that means there will be stronger races fighting today now that the scrubs are all gone. It was a passing, dismissive thought. There was only one thing she wanted, and it would likely prompt the other fighters to put down some extra coin on reinforcing their groin armor before they faced her on the sands. As if the floodgates opened, the seats were quickly filled, but she had eyes for only one spot before the match began. She scanned the crowd, and then saw them. Brain was holding Layali on his shoulders and they were waving down to her ecstatically. He had his broad, charming, roguish smile on his face, and it only then occurred to her. I can't remember the last time I objected when people thought I was his wife. Not in any of the stops since they were in the town with that cursed orphanage. It wasn't, to her mind at least, an unpleasant thought. Though he was weaker in combat, he was stronger in his understanding of the world, and he lavished affection on the little half-elf that had effectively become a daughter. If I met someone stronger, would I want to leave? The question stuck in her mind while she waved back. The sick and twisted answer she came up with was, like my mother, it wouldn't matter. The sense of herself that others considered twisted, a seeming willingness to mate with anyone who could defeat her, was laid bare as she tried to imagine herself willingly walking away from them both. I've just been playing a game with myself, pretending I would be consenting when I've just been finding a way to cope with the nightmarish reality of my mother's life. Her nightmares, her reticence when touching my ears. Oh, I'll have the child of any male who can defeat me. When I really just assumed I'd go through my mother's experience. It was a grim thought, and not the first time she held it, but as she watched the couple waving from the stands and she tried to imagine someone defeating her, and then walking away from the two. She couldn't. No way. She told herself, and with a smile on her face, she waved back at them both. I'm not going anywhere. She resolved without any further doubts, and waited. The Elf King loved the sound of his walking. The world shook when he strolled to relieve himself, his foes quaked when he yawned. His will was their dreams and his rhythm the dictate of the lives of those who were lucky he let them live to serve him. Around him the stone of the arena quaked, He did nothing to disguise his footfalls, nothing to soften his step, and if the stone fell, then that was just a consequence of their pathetic efforts at building things that were impressive. The light of day opened up to him when he stepped onto the sands. The very first of his opponents would be a woman. That was his instruction. A lucky woman who will bear my child, and I will make it right then and there on the sands. A sound slap of my hand, and when she falls, I will have her. The annoyance he felt at losing his servants and toys was still grating, insulting, and above all, a mystery that taunted him because of its familiarity. Just like that time, the Nines came to me to take my prisoners and used undead to distract me before setting them free. Then, the memory of dying, blacking out, then waking up again and his prisoners back where they were, but not the same. So strange. But I never forgot them. He ignored the words of whatever bothersome speaker was up there, barely responding other than to raise his fist when his title was used, until... No. He is not the elf king. He is the elf peasant. He has no kingdom now. The voice of the shouter was tantalizingly familiar. The whelp? That brat? No, her mother? He licked his lips. The draconic queen was the one he wanted to breed. He whirled and faced the stands, and there she was, an adult woman, ripe, and not bad to look at. He felt himself harden with desire, but her words brought only confusion. Do you remember me, elf peasant? She shouted from the stands, and shrank. Tricked? You tricked me? How dare you? He bellowed. The brat wasn't the daughter, but the woman he sought. Your kingdom has fallen. It is now under the reign of my lord, Imz-ul-Gaun of the kingdom of Nazarick, father to all and master of nations. She shouted down at him, and the name caused the elf king to freeze even in his anger. You might know me by another name. A man shouted from beside her. I beat you before, I and my friends. I'm sure you heard it. I'm sure you heard someone say Momonga. A towering man in rich royal robes shouted. The elf king processed it all. He took my kingdom, he took my servants. It has to be him. Momonga. Nines. Perhaps it was Irons. It's all him. Him? Him? The elf king bellowed and jumped from the ground with a roar, leaping toward the dais where his prey had gone to hide, his arms stretched out and fingers grasping ready to close around his stolen plaything. Draudilin's heart sang when she watched the shock on the elf king's face, his dismay, his disbelief, his rage and confusion. At her left stood her lord to whom she had surrendered herself and her people in trust of all their security. And true to the predictions of the master of Nazarick, her god, the elf king reacted with violence. His leap brought cries of fear and shock and awe all at once to the crowd. But then, the elf king was unable to land. Imz's arm was outstretched, his fingers were closed around the elf king's throat. The behemoth of an elf was every bit as large as Draudilin remembered, but now he dangled helplessly. And Imz's kingly voice projected out for all the world to hear. You don't do that to my servants. His free hand was slapping, just slapping, back and forth across the elf king's face as if he were slapping a misbehaving schoolboy who had gone too far with his bullying ways. The elf king gurgled and raged, his face was turning purple and his hands clawing at the Allfather's wrists. You don't do that to my friends. He bellowed the words and continued the assault. Every single slap cracked like thunder as the elf king's face began to bruise and bleed, and before the sight of all nations, the elf king was simply, flatly, bitch-slapped until his strength was gone. Now go down there and die, Imz yelled, and raising the monstrous elf up, he flung his arm down and sent the body to crash into the sands and shake the whole of the arena. Silence befell the whole of the site. The elf king appeared to be alive, but groaning. Finally a speaker's voice called out. As the injury was not sustained during an official duel, it is the ruling of the arbiters of the tournament that the elf king should be healed and allowed to fight. As if that had been the question. But nobody seemed inclined to question it. A healer approached over the sands at a steady jog, cast their spell, and turned to flee before the injured would-be combatant could rise. You're having a bad day, father, Zesh spat as the elf king began to get to his feet. That made him pause and look at her. He had many children, but none that he knew of looked like her. You are. He began and she confirmed it with a nod. You kidnapped my mother from the slain theocracy. You ruined her life, and now I am here to make you pay. You will not enjoy this, and I won't be done quickly, but it won't matter, because you will not survive. She hopped her spit the way Brain showed her, and launched it past her lips to land directly in his eye. He snarled and wiped it away, casting the fluid down to wet the sands. "Bitch. Daughter or not, you're going to breed me strong children. And they'll know their places, and they'll give me the world," he bellowed his furious proclamation, but though the crowd was muted and horrified by the bellow, she was nonplussed. "I am not your prey. You are mine," she said and drew her sword. No sooner than she did so, than power raced through her veins, far more than she'd ever felt in her body before. The former Elf King used every skill he had and she could feel him activating them all. So slow. She thought, it seemed absurd on its face. His arm sailed past her as she stood aside. She looked down at it, watching it move like molasses running downhill. "I wonder?" she asked herself, and reached for his fist. She opened his fingers, and then bent two of them backwards, snapping them at the bone. She broke two more, then the last. Then spun behind him and slashing her sword, she struck his Achilles tendons. Then all was at a normal speed again, and he shouted in pain as he stumbled and fell to the sands. "Pathetic," she said, and kicked him in his ass, sending him tumbling head over heels and heels over head in a steady roll that stopped only when he cracked the stone wall of the arena. The crowd was on its feet, cheering as the self-proclaimed villain was being demolished. "I owe you a lot of pain, you son of a bitch," she shouted and sprinted over to where he lay. She yanked his golden hair and put her foot on his back. She heard the crack of bone within as he struggled. His arms could not, however, reach behind him well, nor could he twist under the pressure she was applying. "Bitch," he hissed. She took her foot from his back, and swung him by his hair back the way he'd come, tumbling over the sands and battering his body with the ground itself. She chased after his tumbling body, and did not allow him to come to a halt a second time. Her hand snatched his ankle, and she began to swing him like a club. She watched his teeth scatter as they were knocked out of his head, sent flying like little white pearls to disappear in the sands as his fearsome face became a bloody ruin. Her arm swung him cleanly overhead, back and forth, as if the world were a drum and she a drummer. His left arm was the first to break, with bone tearing through flesh. His right quickly followed. "Not yet. It's not over yet." The cheers of the crowd were muted, so he heard her words and felt the blow when her fist connected with his crotch. Blood fountained out of his mouth, mixed with the foul taste of vomit, and to his horror, her fingers closed around his manhood and tore. She held his favorite toy above her head like a trophy, dripping blood and pent-up fluids to the sand. He finally cried out in pain. "I suppose this is going to end quicker than I hoped. But all good things must come to an end," she said as he lay broken at her feet. If there was a bone in his body that wasn't turned to powder, she wasn't aware of it. "Since you like splitting legs open, let's see what all the fuss is about," she said, and before he could protest, she dropped his manhood, stomped on it, and grabbed his thighs with her bloody hands. Her fingers were worse than steel as they dug into his muscle, and she began to pull them in different directions. The first tear was audible only to she and he. But then it was clear, obvious, and heard by all as his body was torn in half at the thighs. He had enough life and air left for one single scream, and it was done. The Elf King was in two pieces, torn ragged and unevenly from thighs to chest, a ruined mess only barely identifiable as once having been a man at all. "My mother is now avenged," she said to herself, "and so are the rest of his unfortunate victims. There's only one enemy left. The ones who are keeping my family members as slaves." She turned her eyes up to the dais. The All-Father's power was obvious beyond measure, and yet he hadn't chosen to compete. "The woman, the priestess or shrine maiden, she did this to me. Even as strong as I was never that strong. What did she do? What did Layali offer her?" With the cathartic sense of peace settling over her with the end of the lifelong desire, the mystery remained and some concern with it. Why would they help me? They don't know me. So why? It was a question that demanded an answer, but it would have to wait, for now. She had somewhere else to be, and two people waiting for her there. And with that thought, she walked away from the lumps of meat she left behind, giving an apologetic nod to the unfortunate foursome who rushed past her to clean up the mess. Volume 7 C 117. "Can I look now, Papa?" Layali asked. Her eyes were still concealed by Brain's hands, but she stood with barely concealed patience, her fingers over his thumb, trying in futility to move his hands aside. "Not yet," Brain said. "When your mama gets back," he answered, and though he could feel her pout, he only pursed his lips and waited patiently while the runners shoveled the remnants of the elf peasant onto the wooden sled and hauled it away. All that remained of the former elf king was bloody sand that other fighters would step on and scatter around, or wash off their bodies and down the drains in the baths of the arena's undercroft. When Zeshi returned, Brain removed his hands from Layali's eyes. "Very impressive," he said. "Were you always that strong?" He asked her and silently thanked the gods he did not believe in, that her kick to his ribs had not exploded his body. "No." She frowned. It was like opening up my potential, I think. I think I tasted what my peak could be like. It was definitely me, but me. Unlocked," she said in a reverential whisper. She turned her thoughts back to the morning's events and watched as the next matches unfolded. A large, brown, armored troll entered the arena. On his shoulder he carried a great club the size of a tree and with a single solid iron ball at the head, a grip made with so much leather it had to have taken up the skin of an entire cow. He shook the ground around him as he walked. "Troll Prince, Gaka." The troll announced himself, and clad in scale armor over his arms and torso, and with a metal skirt of banded bars hanging down around his legs secured to a metal belt that went up to his belly button, it was hard to doubt his title. The trolls in the audience cheered as his opponent entered the arena. A ligaman, broad and white-furred, great jaws open to show off that his teeth were capped with jagged metal above and below. His tail lashed at his back, across his chest he wore a breastplate of white, and to his thighs were strapped interlocking greaves through which bits of fur still stuck. His mane bunched around his head, and though he towered half again over any human and was twice as broad, he was only 2/3 the height or width of the troll prince. Raisinma. Devorian champion, cousin of Timna, champion of the Dlalmok. The handful of bejeweled beastmen in the crowd cheered their champion, and glared at the trolls, who glared back with the same ferocity. The troll prince raised his club above his head, and the ligaman raised both his fists. Their roars drowned out the cheers of the crowd. They paced themselves at a distance, and when the signal came, they charged at one another. The ligaman was clearly a monk, while the troll clearly a paladin, and the two began throwing martial arts back and forth. The troll proved quicker than should have been possible, rolling away from the ligaman's thick fists and slashing claws, and charging in, arms pumping back and forth to leap toward the ligaman. Raisinma, unable to escape fast enough, brought up both his hands and caught the mace before it could connect, and sand blew up in such a quantity that it was impossible for anyone not up high to see the clash which followed. But it could be heard. Gwa-ah-ah, the shouted chorus might have been a duet of music as the two clashed in perfect harmony. The troll prince used smite again and again, only for the monk to use his tranquility of water to avoid each blow and create great gaps, holes, in the sand from the force of the scattering blows. Raisinma's fists came for the areas exposed by the armor, forcing Gaka on the defensive where it was hardest. Down below. His metal-armored skirt good for swings but bad against jabs. As soon as the first blow connected and the prince brought back his wounded thigh, the struggle began to change. The troll prince, for perhaps the first time in his life, faced an opponent that was too fast for himself and could pierce his thick hide. Worse, his great height worked against him. He had to bring his club down farther and faster, and the ligaman had plenty of time to avoid blows and come back in again. The crowd was on its feet, roaring and cheering. Human, elf, dwarf, orc, nobody cared anymore. It was the bloodlust and vigor of battle, and it was on every head, young and old, as the champions struggled to find a way to overcome the other. The two finally split, with the ligaman springing back out of reach of what might have proved a killing blow, and the troll was slow to raise his club. The two were breathing hard, chests rising and falling, gulping air and their bodies shaking with the tension. Sweat was dripping down the thick troll hide. The mace did not continue to rise, and Raisinma did not charge in. It was a brief, unspoken truce. Trolls can fight like beastmen. Raisinma breathed out. Beastmen can fight like trolls. Gaka answered back. Ready? Raisinma asked and rose up. Gaka nodded and raised his club the rest of the way. To the end this time, he suggested. Yes. Raisinma answered, and the pair charged again. A bellowing roar of warriors brought the pair close, and the seemingly wild blows began again. The ligaman monk's blows seemed at last to slow just a hair, and in that moment, Gaka did the unexpected. He used his free hand to grab Raisinma's mane and haul the Ligoman off his feet, his mace coming up and ready for the killing blow. Then Rosin did the unexpected. He swung himself up to the arm which held him, locked his legs around the bicep, and arched himself, snapping the arm at the elbow. Gaka howled and lost his grip, and Raisinma dropped, crouched, and jumped to the staggering giant troll. His jaw closed over the troll prince's face, and he bit down. The thick skull cracked, and the troll prince fell limp. Raisinma raised his fists and roared as red blood dripped from his teeth before he pointed to the limp form. "He lives. He will fight again," Raisinma said, and the roar of the crowd redoubled as they found a favorite. When Raisinma was gone, and the crowd had gone silent, and when the troll prince was healed before he limped away in defeat, it was a human who entered the arena. Gustave Montagna of the Roblé Holy Kingdom. The head of the Paladin Order raised his sword as he entered, and cheers went up. The light glinted off of his white and blue armor. His broad body and perfect stance made him appear the epitome of Paladin ideals. But within, he could only feel his heart pound. "A good showing to restore our dignity as a nation, that is all we need," he told himself, and sheathed his blade when the roar of the crowd faded. And his opponent entered after, Cerebrate. Man of no country. The knight shouted his name, but Brain didn't need to hear it, neither did Layali. She wet herself immediately and began to cry, "Mama! Papa! Don't let him get me. Please don't let him see me. Please don't let Master get me again." She whimpered and blubbered and rushed to hide behind Brain and Zeshi. "That's him, is it?" Zeshi asked with gritted teeth. Her hand went behind Brain to stroke Layali's back. "Don't worry, he won't survive much longer. He won't. We won't let him. He'll never touch you again." "No, he won't." Brain crossed his arms and glared at the knight. "He dies today." He squared himself in front of the little half-elf who wept into his back. Volume 7 C 118. Gustave faced his opponent, drew his sword, and the pair began to clash. Gustave fought as a paladin, with broad, heavy slashes, his emblazoned cloak flapping in the breeze behind him, while Cerebrate fought as a knight, with more straight thrusts to force Gustave to withdraw. They circled one another in battle pulses, coming together for an exchange of blows, their armor fending off what their swords could not. The clang of metal on metal was the only noise there was between the two as the crowd picked sides for their favorite. Kalka bit her lip and without thinking, reached for her husband's hand. He squeezed it. "I shouldn't have brought him. I shouldn't have told him to do this. After everything we went through. You disrespect his choice?" Naya asked from where she stood, her hands folded behind her lower back. Her tail danced in time with the blows. She didn't look at her counterpart, but the rebuke was obvious. "Queen Baraha," Ainz quipped, "he is a loyal servant to your ally." His rebuke to her rebuke did not move the Dragonid Queen. "That is why I say it, Allfather. None of you can understand what is happening down there as I do," she said with icy calm as she watched the sword narrowly miss Gustave's eye and leave a bloody streak on his cheek instead. He backed away and wiped it away with a growl before he renewed his struggle against Cerebrate. Naya looked over to Kalka then and said, "You may have given the order, Holy Queen, but I knew Gustave. He's the one who sentenced me to die. To you he was a friend, to me, first he was a commander, then he was an executioner. He knew my trial was corrupt, but he looked me in the eye, and sentenced me to die in that horrific way. He listened to my screams and did nothing to save me. When you rejected my parents' plea for leniency, I forgave you because you were ignorant of the true corruption. I can never forgive him though, and that's why he's here. Because he can't forgive himself." Kalka paled, "But I issued pardons for everybody who confessed their crimes and made restitution. We've been rebuilding our homes, our kingdom, making things right. The purity movement, Gustave has worked closely with the priests since we embraced it. Do you think that means anything to someone who lived on principle their whole life?" Naya asked and waved toward the sands of the arena. "Yes, he's going to do what you said and enhance your nation's reputation, but he's going to atone too. I've seen it on enough faces to know the look. His quietness, from the very start of our journey I had my suspicions. But this removes all doubt." The wounds on Gustave were starting to add up. His ear was gone, one eye was shut, and though Cerebrate had his marks, it became ever more obvious that Gustave was at a disadvantage that was only growing. Cerebrate seemed to be waiting for a concession, and drew back an extra step. "You can't be serious. Kalka cried and shot to her feet. Death? That's stupid. We need him. He's our friend, the head of our paladin order. I didn't want him to fight to the death. Just showcase our strength. Her voice began to rise in pitch and she rushed toward the rail, her fingers closed over the ledge. She leaned over. Give in. Your queen orders you to concede, she shouted, but over the noise of the crowd there was little chance that she would be heard so far down below. If he heard her, he ignored her, and charged against Cerebrate again. Imes was quick to follow his wife, rising to his feet and putting hands on her shoulders as if afraid she might tumble over the edge. Swords flew back and forth and, now that Queen Baraha pointed it out, it was obvious. It wasn't that he was reckless, it was that he was heedless. His strikes were flawless, but his care for his own injuries and the preservation of his own life was completely gone, and when he landed a blow against Cerebrate's chest after a dangerous gamble and sent the Knight of the Draconic Kingdom tumbling backward, he squared himself off, revealing the multitude of wounds to his face, and trailing blood into the dry sands to soak them through and through. The resolve of the Holy Kingdom cannot be stopped by anything but victory or death. Get up, Cerebrate, Gustav shouted it like an order, and Cerebrate complied. You're insane. Cerebrate accused his opponent, leveling his sword at Gustav. With both men breathing hard, he spat into the sand and said, You can't win. I got you twice in the gut. I don't even have to kill you, just hold you off and you'll die. Gustav grinned, his pearl-white teeth stained with his own blood. That's why you're afraid. Because we're not. We don't know the meaning of fear anymore. He proclaimed and leveled his sword at his side, and with a thunderous battle cry his feet carried him forward over the sands toward his waiting enemy. Fuck. He's suicidal. Cerebrate muttered. Knight's charge. He used one more martial art, and sped toward his enemy. A direct charge was a knight's best weapon, and Gustav seemed to have played into it. Still, ever cautious, Cerebrate watched for trickery, and found none. His sword sank into Gustav's guts for a third time, their shoulders crashed together with a clang of battered metal on battled metal, and Cerebrate felt the man fall limp. Gustav looked up to the dais where his queen stood. Her face was clear to him, or so he thought. I wonder if I'm imagining it. No, she probably is distressed. I've been part of her life for as long as she's been on the throne, if not as close as Remedios. But this is how it has to end. The reputation of my kingdom. Nobody will think us weak now. With my death, our names are made. And... fuck, this really does hurt worse than I thought. Gustav groaned and felt his body thud down to the ground. The roar of the crowd went up, and his killer stepped out of view. With Cerebrate out of the way, the sun smacked Gustav's eyes, blinding him to the blue of the sky. There was no rest of the world, and he could no longer feel the sand beneath him, nor the weight of his body. He then closed his eyes, and opened them no more. Job well done, he thought, and that was that.